Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and my bad idea for this week is the production of a video game called Duke Nukem Forever.
A very, very nuanced and complicated game.
Oh yes, philosophers have been writing books about the Duke Nukem franchise for years, Tony. All the way back in 1991, the first one came out. It was just called Duke Nukem, as you might imagine, and it started its life as a side-scrolling PC game. There was not much that was innovative about it. It was typical of similar games. It was a shooter. The graphics were borrowed from other games. The gameplay was borrowed from other games. Even the name Duke Nukem was not original. It had been stolen from a 2-bit Captain Planet villain. But the game did well enough to warrant a sequel, which in turn led to a threequel. And for the third game, the developers decided to break out of the side-scrolling platformer model and instead venture into the new world of three-dimensional gaming. And they came out with a game called Duke Nukem 3D.
I remember that one. That was a great game. For my 7-year-old self, or whatever I was.
A lot of people at the time thought so, Tony, and it became wildly popular, partly because of its innovative interactive environments, but also because it directly catered to adult gamers with gratuitous violence, tongue-in-cheek humor, and sexual content. Namely, strippers.
Yes, I remember the pixelated strippers very well.
The game was a huge hit, and that inevitably meant that there was a sequel coming. And so, on April 28th, 1997, Duke Nukem 3D creator George Broussard announced Duke Nukem Forever. And the initial plan was to have the game completed by the next year. Remember, Duke Nukem 3D had come out in 1995, and they thought a 3-year turnaround was doable, so they were going to have Duke Nukem Forever out in 1998. Unfortunately, that plan ran into problems almost immediately. The initial work on Duke Nukem Forever had been done in the Build game engine used to create Duke Nukem 3D. Build is the name of this program. And the problem was, by the time they got into development in force, the Build engine was out of date. A lot of these early 3D games didn't do what you might call true 3D. They sort of extrapolated 3D from 2D, so you would draw, if you were the game designer, you would draw a two-dimensional object, and then the walls would come up from that object, and that's how the computer would render the 3D. And by the time Duke Nukem Forever was supposed to come out, games had gotten true 3D, specifically the Quake franchise, and so they had to develop the game for an entirely new platform.
I mean, this sounds like it's a pretty good idea to take, if you want to compete, to actually go back and take a little more time with the game and make it into true 3D.
Right, and as I mentioned, Quake was a thing, and it already existed. The Quake engine existed, despite the fact that they had developed several years' worth of assets for the Build engine. They thought, we'll go back, we'll redo all this stuff, and we will buy the Quake 2 engine. They didn't want to build their own engine from the ground up. Quake 2 is where it's at, so 3D Realms pays $500,000 to license the Quake 2 engine, which was $200,000 more than they had spent in the entire development of Duke Nukem 3D. But they were rolling in the cash, so they could afford it. With the new engine in hand, they cobbled together a few screenshots of what the game might eventually look like, put them out in the trade magazines, and got back to work. However, almost immediately after they licensed the Quake 2 engine, Epic Games revealed something even more groundbreaking in the game design world, a new engine called Unreal. And if you know anything about games these days, or if you've played a game these days, you'll probably recognize this because the Unreal Engine, in some iteration, is still going strong today.
Yeah, there are a ton of games still using the Unreal Engine.
And the great thing about the Unreal Engine at the time was that it was good at rendering a wide open landscape, something that the Quake engine was not good at, and 3D Realms wanted a wide open landscape for Duke Nukem Forever, and so they decided, 14 months after switching to the Quake 2 engine, that they would switch once again to the Unreal Engine, scrapping that $500,000 investment and 14 months of work that they had put into building assets in the Quake 2 engine.
That's a huge jump to do it again. Like, just over and over and over again, switching these.
It seemed like a big switch, but, they were in PR mode, and the head of 3D Realms, George Broussard, claimed that this switch wouldn't set them back more than a month or two. However, this was not what you might call the truth. The fact was they were going to have to start development from scratch again. Later that year, the Duke Nukem Forever team would update to another version of Unreal Engine, and this practice of skipping from engine to engine was symptomatic of project lead George Broussard's larger management problems. He didn't have a clear vision of exactly what he wanted the game to be, so he just kept incorporating new stuff and new ideas as they occurred to him. And there was a thing that went around the office at 3D Realms at the time was just like, don't let George play any new games, because they'll come to us and be like, oh, they've got this cool thing, why don't we put that in there? And we'll just never get this thing completed. That did not work, though, because he kept incorporating new ideas, and they almost never got the game completed. Despite all of these setbacks, gamers were still excited for the upcoming Duke Nukem Forever, and they were given more reasons to be excited when footage of the game played at E3 2001. There was amazing interactivity, and the animation was just incredible for the time. People were talking about the hair physics and the way the mouths matched up with what the words were being said, and this was big stuff at the time, and it was incredibly realistic, again, for the time. During this time, the publishing rights for Duke Nukem Forever had changed hands several times, but they would eventually end up in the hands of Take-Two Studios. And Take-Two, having this new hit franchise in their lap, decided that they wanted to start making some money, so they pressured Broussard to wrap up development and put something out. The problem was, despite the fact that they had the distribution rights, they didn't have much leverage over Broussard because his studio had been personally financed off of the profits that he made off of Duke Nukem 3D, and he could afford to just sit there and tweak and twiddle for as long as he wanted to. He could quite literally afford to be a perfectionist, and so he was. He could keep on adding to and changing Duke Nukem Forever as much as he wanted, and no one could tell him no.
Even with Take-Two breathing down his neck?
Take-Two didn't have any leverage. They wanted a game to sell, but he didn't owe them anything. They just owned the rights to sell the game, so they could come and be yelling at him if they wanted to, but he owned his own studio, so he could take as long as he wanted to. And there's an interesting conundrum here, I think, because a lot of people like to hold up the artist as this person with this perfect vision, and when money people get involved, it's just terrible, and the money people ruin it, and if they would just leave the artist alone to make his thing, it would be wonderful and the world would be great. And yet, I think art thrives in a certain sense under the pressures of commercialism. The need to get something finished at some point is usually a positive influence on an artistic work of any kind.
Yeah, deadlines are important.
And the other problem that Broussard and his team had was that they were developing Duke Nukem Forever in sort of this mid to early 90s mentality. And video games in the 90s were small affairs. Even the larger studios were still relatively small because it was a niche market. Not everybody had a computer. Computer games weren't seen as a huge market at the time, and so game studios were all relatively small. But as they moved into the 2000s, that was changing. Game studios were getting bigger and bigger and making bigger and bigger games, and Broussard was trying to continue developing under that old small studio model, which meant that they could not make the changes fast enough to keep up with the technology and the other games that were being developed.
Yeah, that was a time whenever you started seeing things go from like a dozen people and like a huge life cycle to giant 80, 100 person companies, and like the GTA style games were starting to come out and everything. I remember that being a huge drastic time for gaming.
Right. And if you're a company with 18 people working at it, which 3D Realms was, you didn't have the ability to compete on a production level with somebody that had 100 people. Broussard kept chasing the latest and greatest technology had to offer, but he didn't have the team he needed to catch up with that technology. In 2004, 3D Realms changed the physics system in Duke Nukem Forever, and despite industry buzz, there was no showing of the game at E3 2005.
Just a reminder of where we're at. Whenever this thing started, I was 10 years old, and whenever this is at now, I'm graduating high school.
And they're still working on it. It's easy to see, by the way. You can understand this guy puts out this game that was seen as relatively groundbreaking at the time, and he wants to follow that up with another groundbreaking game. His idea of we got to make it the best and the greatest and have all the coolest stuff in it is an understandable instinct, but it really worked against him as he just could not get it up to his standards, what he thought other people's standards would be for a finished Duke Nukem sequel. Relations between publisher Take-Two and 3D Realms became increasingly strained, obviously, and it became clear that the pressure was getting to George Broussard. In public interviews, he repeatedly expressed his apologies that the game was not completed, but he continued to insist that he would not ship the game until it was, quote, finished. The thing was, the game was closer to being finished than Broussard was able to see. In 2007, he hired a man named Raphael van Lierop to be the project's creative director, and Lierop played through the game and was blown away by how much content there was in the Duke Nukem as it existed at the time, and he thought it was pretty innovative. He said to Broussard, listen, man, this is great stuff. You put this out now, just cap it off, right? Just make it flow a little bit better and, put an ending on it or whatever, and we are going to blow everyone out of the water. Broussard, though, was not interested in just finishing up and blowing people out of the water. He had a grand vision. And while Lierop said they could have the game out in a year, Broussard said, we're at least 2 years out, guys. So nobody get antsy because we're going to ride this for the long haul. And ride it they did. And in 2007, things seemed to be looking up for 3D Realms. The company released a new Duke Nukem Forever trailer near the end of the year, and despite the pessimism from Broussard, many in the gaming community held out hope for a 2008 release of Duke Nukem Forever. At this point in the document, by the way, that we're using, I got tired of writing out Duke Nukem Forever and abbreviated it, and that was the point where I realized that the initials DNF also stand for did not finish. Unfortunately for the hopeful gamers, 2008 passed and 2009 rolled in with money problems for George Broussard. After having sunk $20 million of his own and his partner's money into DNF, 3D Realms was out of cash. They had to lay off most of their workers and work shut down on Duke Nukem Forever. Take-Two Studios, infuriated that they still didn't have a finished game, sued 3D Realms for breach of contract, but that lawsuit eventually fizzled out. Still, it didn't change the fact that 3D Realms was broke. Duke Nukem Forever was dead. Except it wasn't. Despite the fact that 3D Realms had gone under, several company personnel continued to develop the game, working from home in a collaboration that would eventually become a new studio called Triptych Games. And in 2010, Gearbox Games, another studio led by a Duke Nukem 3D alumnus, Randy Pitchford, came to Duke's rescue. Possibly because of their desperate condition, the Duke Nukem Forever team finally managed to put together an actual game. The first playable bits of Duke Nukem Forever showed at PAX 2010, and shortly thereafter a demo was released. The game was scheduled to be released in May of 2011, but inevitably there was yet another delay.
Yeah, but that's still a huge difference having a build ready and actually being able to show it at PAX and have people mess with it than where they were at before, where you had basically stills of things and that's it.
Yes. Finally, on June 14th, 2011, the game 15 years in the making hit store shelves. 15 years, by the way, is the current Guinness World Record for the longest development time on a video game from conception to release.
I feel like there's going to be some games that push that just because they never get out of alpha anymore.
I don't know if that counts.
That's true. If you're selling the game, I guess you can say it's been released, even if it is a beta version like what they do on Steam all the time.
Duke Nukem Forever, the long-awaited franchise finale for Duke Nukem, was released and met with a resounding from games journalists.
That's probably because Duke Nukem was a product of the 90s. He was part of the attitude generation that they were building up there. The whole, just big, bodacious, blonde, muscled dude and everything. It didn't play as well anymore.
Some of it was the gameplay as well. The gameplay that had been cutting edge and, sort of groundbreaking was old and stale because of how long this development cycle had taken. The graphics were also subpar. The game was criticized for being somewhat glitchy. There were really long load screens. And the adult themes, quote unquote, that had made Duke Nukem 3D seem edgy in 1995 now came off as kinda creepy and sexist. There was apparently a segment of the game where there were women who had been forcibly impregnated by aliens, and you had to kill them before the alien babies hatched and killed them.
I've seen that movie.
Problematic, I would say, is the word I would describe that with. The game that had taken 15 years to produce really looked its age. And the players weren't much more excited. Duke Nukem Forever sold half as many copies as had been expected when the initial investment of Take-Two in 3D Realms happened. But the game would still end up being profitable for Gearbox. Not by a lot. It was not what anyone would call a hit. It did not burn up the charts. It's not a classic today, Tony. But they didn't quite take a hosing.
Yeah, they literally resurrected it in their free time and put something out. They were able to do what Broussard could not. So I give them props for that. And even if the game wasn't great or it was just a little bit too 90s, there were a lot of people I know that actually did enjoy the game just for that weird bit of plasticky looking nostalgia.
I will say, I went and read some recent reviews of the game, and the general consensus is not that bad.
Yeah, you don't want that for a game that took 15 years to make, but It's still better than could not review or DNF.
It's I think an example of sort of the planning stage taking over the artistic craft, where there's a certain point where you have to make the thing and put it out. And the fact that they kept making it and kept making it and kept making it was Duke Nukem's downfall. If they just put something out, even if they just released it in their old engine, I think, and put it out in the time frame that they'd had, they could have turned around and made Duke Nukem 5 ever, in 2005 or whatever, with whatever the cool engine was, Unreal at the time.
Yeah, it sounds like they could have also had a hit back in 2007 or something, whenever they hired that new manager, and he was saying it could be awesome. If they would have just put 6 months in and capped off the game, you could have been talking about a huge hit.
It seems like it. The most amusing thing that I read about this was the fact that Wired Magazine kept putting it on their top 10 vaporware of the year, and they got so sick of the fact that it wasn't coming out that they retired Duke Nukem, and then it actually was going to come out and they had to bring the category back. So it spent 7 years on their vaporware of the year, non-consecutive, by the way, because of how long this development cycle was.
Man, vaporware is so much more expensive today because it's all pre-bought stuff. So at least we were lucky and didn't have to pay for it. Although there are a few people out there that as soon as Duke Nukem was announced bought the GameStop pre-release and still had their receipts from 1997. So I guess some people had that early investment.
I did not get any information on that, but I would love to see. YouTube was around at this time. Someone must have a YouTube video of them in 2011 going with their GameStop receipt and trying to redeem a copy of Duke Nukem Forever. They're lucky that GameStop is still in business to possibly honor that.
Yeah, I mean, if you bought it back then, it might have only been a $40 game, too. Then again, that was $1997, so it's probably about the same.
That's how it works, Tony.
Yep.
But that's the bad idea for this week. Nothing terribly world-shattering. People might have lost their jobs, and that would be unfortunate. But really, it's just a game that wasn't that great. But I think we can learn something from it. I think if you're someone who's making something, you can learn something from Duke Nukem Forever. That having all of the creative freedom that you want is not necessarily the answer to your problems. That sometimes that's actually more of a hindrance than a help. And that was the most interesting thing for me about researching this, is to see this guy who could have made anything he wanted to and ended up almost making nothing because of that freedom.
Did he ever comment on the game? Like, did you find anything on that?
I did not find anything about Broussard post-release. I did not go digging for that. I'm sure he has said something at some point in the years since then, but I don't have it in front of me, Tony, so I cannot help you with that.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next week with more bad ideas. Hit us up on Twitter at Human Echoes, or send us your bad ideas to badideashow@gmail.com. Let us know what you want us to talk about, and yeah, we will see you then.
Also, don't forget about our Patreon. We're over there at patreon.com/humanechoes.
Bye.